Hello and welcome to this mini lecture on the Frankfurt School of Popular Culture, Part 2. And in this mini lecture, we're just going to take a look at a few examples to better define or make sense of. As you can see, the image I have up here is, of course, of the various iPods, and just that idea of standardization, right? This has become our standard for music listening, and pseudo-individualization. You can have all these different types of potential iPods. You know, your iPhone, your all these different ones, but they all do the same thing. And yet, I've certainly known a fair share of people, myself included, at one time or another, that have ended up with more than one iPod. And so that raises that interesting question of why are we spending, our money and our attention on getting more of the same things. But we're going to take a look at coffee, as we've looked at coffee before in this class, and try to kind of get a sense of how all of this works within, at least within the Frankfurt school critique of popular culture. So we get up in the morning, and many of us, though not all of us, have our morning coffee. And we have that coffee so that we can function, right? Whether we're going to Dunkin's or Starbucks or just making our coffee at home or when we get to work using the Keurig machine, we are all drinking lots of coffee so that we can function. And we need to function because most of us are going to work. Even school is a form of work, right? So we get our coffee so that we can function, so that we can get to work. And of course we work so that we can afford entertainment. Right? I say this, many of us certainly work just to cover ends meet, but the goal of working, of education, all of that, is to work only so much and then to afford your entertainment. Right, then to afford your tickets to the show, to your, the new ginormous screen TV that you got, the new gaming system, an upgrade on your cell phone, a new car, right? So we do all of these things. A new car when you don't necessarily need one. So, right, we get our coffee in order to function, we function in order to work, we work well beyond what we need to in order to get our entertainment, and our entertainment often consumes us enough so that we don't sufficiently rest. And so therefore we lack rest, so when we get up in the morning we need that coffee in order to function, in order to work, in order to have our entertainment, which produces a lack of rest, right? So through the Frankfurt School, this would be seen as that distraction cycle, that the ways in which we create distractions to actually avoid engaging fully in the world around us. It keeps us focused to limited things that are produced by the culture industry. So the culture industry gives us choices, but of degree, right? That's that pseudo-individualization, right? Yes, we have choices, right? But they really only of a certain degree. They're not really categorical choices, right? So ultimately, we can have any type of any type of iPod we want, but they're really all essentially do the same thing, or the difference isn't spectacular, and we're limited, right? So I keep talking about iPads and iPods because I think these are a good example or a good discussion point that we're all familiar with, but we're limited with what we can do. We purchase music now, even less so than with CDs, and it's limited what we can do. If I buy music, I can't share that per se with my friends, even though I somehow own it, right? So when we get into intellectual properties and the limitations and restrictions on them, we increasingly see this pseudo-individualization take place. And then the big thing to remember with this is that the profits will determine the cultural forms, and that such things within popular culture privilege profits, or profit is privileged. If it makes money, then it sticks, regardless of whether it's important or not. And also embedded with this profits determining cultural forms is that you start to see the rise of planned obsolescence, right? Through the culture industry point of view, you don't create things that are permanent. The goal is to keep people buying and investing in that pseudo individualization, so you don't actually allow for sustained forms. So a good example of that is, of course, disposable razors. Disposable razors, of course, mean you have to keep buying razors. You're continually buying new ones, and if you look at something like Gillette in their Mach series, right? That's M-A-C-K, M-A-C-H. They're Mach, as in like fast. Right, they have, they have the Mach 3 and the Mach 3 Hyper and the Mach 4, and it's all of this is, of course, pitching somehow a new and improved when it's really not that new, not that improved. And of course, disposable razors are only supposed to last a certain period of time. You're not buying a permanent razor that you could use forever. You have to buy something that needs replacing, right? So that's planned obsolescence. That's worked into, if you think about whenever you buy a product now, particularly from a place like Best Buy and the like, you're offered a service plan, and you have to raise that question. If I'm buying a product of quality, why do I need a service plan for a year? I would think whatever I'd buy, if that's an electronic gadget, should last more than a year. But that's planned obsolescence. That's attempting to offer, a product that is going to have a purposeful, not accidental, a purposeful, we only want these items to last so long. So again, that's part of the culture industry, creating pseudo needs, creating pseudo individualization, and creating reasons for you to go out and buy again. So we've talked in these two lectures about critical theory and the Frankfurt School and the ideas that they offer up, and they are one means, or historically one way, of approaching and looking at popular culture. But there are some challenges to them that are worth acknowledging and talking about before anybody goes head over heels and thinks this is, this is how we should look at popular culture. We should, but we should remember these critiques of critical theory and have them in the back of our heads whenever we're using them. The first is that it produces on mass production, not individual creators. Right, so critical theory is talking about the mass production of things, but doesn't actually give privilege to individuals, and that is problematic in so much as we have seen historically how individual creators have changed or influenced what happens. Everything. You could talk about the Beatles. You could talk about Nirvana. You can look at individuals and how they change what goes on. And I think that's an important missing piece, that it just talks about the product and not the people behind it or the people invested in it. And it doesn't distinguish between functional artifacts and textual artifacts, right? And so what I mean by this, a functional artifact are purpose-based products, right? Whether that's your car, whether that's whether that's a mop, whether that's things that are there to serve some purpose, versus textual artifacts, which are content-based. That is, the stories on, the stories in a book or in a film, or the actual, the ideas in these things. And in the failure to distinguish between those two things, I think, is important because, or it's certainly problematic because of the ways in which the ideas embedded in certain texts, be they film, book, radio, what have you, are just as important within popular culture, not just the actual physical objects or the kind of shell to which we put those ideas into. It lacks empirical evidence. That is, nothing. There's been no actual study of this or no way of actually pulling this together to prove it. It just says this is out there, and you'll find a lot of the theories that we look at that lacks empirical evidence. They're based on strong intellectual analysis, but no real follow-through. So it's hard to say, oh, that's definitely true. Again, it's still an elite stance on popular culture, very much like mass culture theory. When it talks about true needs, when it talks about things that are really important, those are still often grounded in elite tastes. And so there is still this disregard for popular culture that makes it questionable. That raises a question about how, if you're judging something from the get-go, or believing there's, you're wanting to remove this in lieu of that, that does raise some questions. Um, and it criticizes standardization while at the same time creating its own, right? So critical theory says, oh, that standardization of the culture industry is bad. But by offering up a theory, offering up a way in which you say this is how you view the world, you're offering your own standardization. So the question raises, well, what makes yours better? Or how can you throw this standardization out at the behest of your own view on standardization? And it says that capitalism is stable, and as we've looked at the last, the economic disaster of the late 2000s, and that we're still here in 2014 feeling the repercussions from. It's kind of hard to say that capitalism is entirely stable. It isn't, and we've seen the impacts from that in a variety of ways. And it can't explain culture industry failures. I have the film Waterworld up there from the 1990s. People probably, if you're not old enough, aren't familiar with this movie, but it's basically a good example of hundreds of millions of dollars pumped into a film that flopped. Now, if the culture industry what the Frankfurt School says it is, the everything they invest in should be a hit. And yet there are plenty of flops. There are plenty of movies and CDs and books that just go right down the drain. So that's one of the reasons why we're questionable about critical theory and the Frankfurt School, is that it implies that they should know what they're doing and that there should never be failures. And yet there are lots of failures within things produced by the culture industry. And then it also infantilizes adults. That is, it limits, their agency, their intelligence. It kind of promotes or refers them or represents them as child or as children, as babies, as people who are completely and easily manipulated and just continually need, or have this incessant need. And I don't know that I'm entirely comfortable with that, seeing as how I like to think of myself as an adult. And then they also fail to give us a sense or clear distinction of what's a false need and what's a real need. Who gets to decide that? How is that decided? What do we mean by real needs? Is real needs simply, enough food to survive day to day and enough shelter so that you're not doing harm to yourself? What is a real need versus a false need in a culture, among a people? It doesn't ever really give us a clear sense of that. And then, of course, no clear idea of what fulfillment of real needs would look like. What would it look like for somebody to be fulfilled, to have their real needs met? Can we, what is that image? There's no way to actually substantially embody that. And then finally, another quote from Dominic Strinati. In this picture, true needs are seen as abstract, ahistorical, and utopian aspects of human nature, and yet always have to be achieved in specific historical and social circumstances. This means that the attempt to distinguish between false and true needs in a way which has empirical relevance is never considered. How can needs be defined without reference to their social definition, historical transformation, and practical fulfillment or non-fulfillment? So again, here's that idea of, there's this utopic view of what that true needs is, but you can't, this abstract idea needs actual concrete manifestation in the world that we live. It can't just be an idea of what it should be. We need an exact understanding of how it can be in the world that we offer. Alright, that's all for now. Thank you very much for listening, and see you in the next video.